First of all, the paper I published last year on the legal and political context of Brexit and animal protection. Secondly, a paper I published earlier in the year on the threats the Brexit poses to animal protection. Thirdly, we're going to look at the opportunities based on a paper that I've just submitted. And fourthly, actually sort of make a judgment as to whether Brexit, all things considered, will be overall good or bad for animal protection. And just to show you, I've written a couple of blogs as well, and I see this as a sort of a really, really big issue. And I've argued, in terms of Brexit and animal protection, I've argued that Brexit will actually have more of an effect on sentient non-humans compared to what the effect it will have on humans. So, legal and political context. So there's been a number of reports published on Brexit and animal protection. For example, the House of Lords on the left, A-Law and the Wildlife and Countryside Link, a coalition of leading NGOs, a very detailed report. Peter Stevenson wrote a report for the Centre for Food Policy. These reports are excellent. They review the opportunities and the threats, but I sort of wanted to go beyond that a little bit and look at how likely these threats and opportunities are likely to materialise. So to do that, I created a framework. It's obviously a very complex issue to look into. There's lots of different sectors of animals. There's different forms of Brexit. We need to consider animals in the UK, the EU, and on an international basis. So essentially, the framework looks at all of those questions, finishing up with what are the magnitude of the various threats, how likely are the various threats and opportunities likely to materialise, and all things considered, will Brexit be a net positive or negative for animal protection? So the European Union, to start with a kind of regulatory context and political and economic context, it's important to see where we are as a baseline, if you like. The European Union is a political and economic union of 28 member states. The idea really, the rationale is to pool sovereignty, which of course creates the Brexiteer argument, for the greater good, if you like. And overall it's been a success project over the last 40 or 50 years. It's based most recently on the Lisbon Treaty, and we know Article 13 is part of that Lisbon Treaty. I think it's important to be aware that the EU is mostly small member states, and the UK leaving the EU isn't just a sort of an average member state, it's one of the larger, more politically and economically powerful member states, so again the impact is going to be bigger. Institutions, European Court of Justice, Commission, Parliament, Council and so on. I think to understand the European Union and therefore the impact of Brexit on animal protection, the single market and the customs union are key. The single market is a common market for the free trade, the freedom of movement, of people, of capital, of services and of goods. And it's goods that are particularly important in this context because animals are classified legally as commodities and are traded dead and alive, essentially. And the EU also has the common agricultural policy. So the UK, as a member state, has limited influence, in a sense, on its own agricultural policy. There's a common agricultural policy across the EU for a level playing field for farmers. So looking at the legal context, if you like, this is a table taken from that first paper looking at the different categories of animals. The take-home message from this slide is really that the UK and the EU animal protection regulation is highly integrated. Around 80% of UK animal protection laws are based on EU law. The EU Withdrawal Act 2018 has nationalised most of this regulation, which was one of the major threats if we left the EU without nationalising much of this legislation. The one piece of regulation that hasn't been nationalised is Article 13, which we'll talk about later. But with those different categories of animals, with this question, would British animals vote to leave the European Union? it's a complex question with different categories of animals. If we can maybe narrow down to a sector of animal use or a species that will have a much bigger influence on this question, then we can focus on that sort of political context, essentially. So if we just focus for now on this UK column, we raise and slaughter around 1 billion land farmed animals in the UK every year. Over 95% of those are poultry and chicken, broiler chicken in particular. In contrast to that, there's around 4 million experimental procedures, around 8 or 9 million cats or dogs apiece. Okay, so you can see from those figures, and bear in mind that there's 1,000 million in a billion, you can see that farm animals dwarf the other categories of animals. The second point that I want to make with this slide, if you look across this agricultural row here, is that really, we don't just want to focus on the UK alone. You can see that in the EU, whereas we have 1 billion land farmed animals in the UK, we have nearly 5 billion in the EU, and we have around 10 billion in the US as an example. So based on those figures, it's actually likely that the impact of Brexit on animal protection isn't going to be determined by its impact on UK-based animals, but on EU and international-based animals. So that's an important consideration to bear in mind. Just to drive this point home, Gaverick Matheny and Cheryl Leahay wrote about this back in 2007. These are US-based authors. 98% of animals raised and killed in the US are farmed animals. And so the animal welfare issue is numerically reducible to the farm animal welfare issue. And that's a good point for animal protection broadly. But what if the individual animals, let's say farmed animals, weren't actually as affected by Brexit as much as, say, wild animals? Then it wouldn't be good to focus on farmed animals. But actually the reverse is the case, because, as we said earlier, the Common Agricultural Policy is common to all member states. And if we leave the European Union, all forms of Brexit mean leaving the CAP, and therefore we determine our own agricultural policy. So, for example, we've had the agriculture bill. Much of the Brexit argument is about the UK having its own trade policy and so on. So the changes per animal are likely to be greater as well. So the greatest threat to animal protection, so in that first paper I sort of reviewed the threats and the opportunities, is the import of lower welfare products from the US based on, for example, this House of Lords report. We'll talk about that more later. What about the forms of animal protection? So this can get a little bit complicated. This is a table taken from Brexit Task Force document. We've got sort of Norway options, Swiss option, EU, Norway option, Swiss option, customs union, favoured by Labour, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, probably similar to May's deal, and WTO. I think the point to make here is that, first of all, Theresa May's withdrawal agreement was a hard Brexit, meaning that the UK would leave both the single market and the customs union, but actually it was quite a soft Brexit for animals, and that's because the agricultural industry essentially stayed within a common rule book, which was kind of like staying in a single market. And because hard Brexit means more risk to animals, essentially that wasn't so bad, if you like, or it mitigated the risks. Boris Johnson's no-deal type Brexit that the government are pursuing, animals will be outside the single market and the customs union, and that will be a much bigger threat for animals. Okay, so I think this is it's a really important point here in terms of the status quo. David Bowles of the RSPCA sort of described the European Union as like a fortress for animal welfare. First of all, the European Union has, just to make one point, the European Union on a global basis has very high animal welfare standards. Many of us in this room would like them to be much higher in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense on a global basis they are very high. And the animal welfare is protected both by regulation and also by high tariffs to prevent the import of lower welfare products. So this is the status quo. So the conclusions from that paper: one, we can really look at farmed animals. The impact on farmed animals will determine the overall impact of Brexit on animal protection. The major threat is the importation of lower welfare products, for instance, from the US. The major opportunity relates to reforming our own agricultural policy outside of the CAP to promote high welfare. I've talked about Theresa May's soft Brexit for animals. I actually wrote this slide some months ago before May resigned, and then there was a risk of the right of the Conservative Party taking over, which has subsequently happened. The RSPCA have described a no-deal and WTO rules Brexit as catastrophic for farm animal welfare. And there's still the possibility to remain in the EU. So looking at the threats. So when I looked at the threats and the opportunities, I categorised them in terms of these 5 criteria: political, regulatory, economic and trade, institutional and capacity related, and EU and international factors. And I'm just going to focus on some of the more important ones, which have got asterisks there. So going back to the EU having the most progressive animal welfare laws in the world, the argument here is it seems prima facie problematic to argue that leaving the European Union is going to be good for animal welfare if the European Union has got the most progressive animal welfare laws in the world. So there's a range of animal protection. The first protection in the 70s here, species-specific protection in the 80s, the Protocol on Amsterdam later developed into Article 13 and so on. Importantly as well, which I'll come back to later in these black boxes, are the EU's influence on the international stage, because the UK can't really compete with the likes of the US and China. They're far more politically and economically powerful, whereas the EU can. And that's an important point I'll come back to. The inherent threat to massive political change, Article 13 is a very good example of that. As I said earlier, we've nationalised most of the animal protection regulation, but if we leave, for instance, on October the 31st, essentially sentient animals will be downgraded in terms of their moral and legal status, as I see it, because they'll no longer be recognised as sentient beings. And the government will no longer have a duty to pay full regard to animal welfare when making policy. So the right-wing nature of Brexit, again, this slide was developed a few months ago before May's resignation, and this character here is now got a lot more power than he did then. Amongst these faces, you have some sort of free trade, Atlanticist type figures who would like to reduce subsidies, perhaps free trade with the US, bring in chlorinated chicken and so on. But the argument here is really generally right-wing politics supports a small state, deregulation or self-regulation, and likes to give consumers the choice. So if we look at the Conservative government that's actually delivering Brexit, what's their record on animal welfare? I think we can describe that as mixed. There has been some progressive policies, mandatory CCTV, ban on the sale of ivory in the UK, Lucy's Law and so on, but also some regressive policies. We've already talked about Article 13. There was a policy recently, you may remember, to repeal the codes of animal welfare. There was a big reaction to that in the media and with the public and the NGOs, and the government U-turned. But that's a great example of a more right-wing government deregulating and asking, in this case, the industry to self-regulate. They asked the farming industry to replace the code with guidance. In the last few manifestos, they've had a pledge to have a free vote on the Hunting Act and the ongoing policy of widespread badger culling against scientific and public opinion, which has just resurfaced again in the media in recent days. So Peter Stevenson, who spoke this morning in his report, talked about influential voices arguing for the dilution of UK standards, and in particular removing import tariffs. As we said earlier, the EU is like a fortress for animal welfare. It has high tariffs to keep other products out. And Peter Stevenson is absolutely correct. One of the interesting things in the last couple of years is watching this debate even at the highest level with the US president. But in March 2019, this is Woody Johnson. He's the ambassador, the US ambassador to the UK, and he called EU farming practices like a museum of agriculture. And this was related to the criticism of chlorine chicken and so on. Donald Trump, Woody Johnson is standing with Donald Trump there, so an influential figure. Donald Trump himself has criticised, I think a year or so ago, May's soft Brexit. This isn't theoretical stuff. The US is a big agricultural exporter. It wants to export its beef and its chicken to the UK, and it's wanted to open up the EU market for decades, and it's been sort of having running battles in the World Trade Organization and so on. So this was an interesting article because it was written by, this was in response to Woody Johnson's article. It was written by the former Food and Farming Minister George Eustice, and he'd actually resigned a few weeks before because of one of May's political decisions, and he wouldn't have written this article had he been a minister, very critical of the US, and it's a good article to read. Someone who is fairly clued up on animal welfare, very critical of the US and their standards. And just to look more closely, just to compare those standards, the EU, we have the Treaty of Lisbon to recognise animals as sentient, no sentience legislation in the US. We have pretty good slaughter regulation in the protection of animals at time of killing. In the US, they have the Humane Slaughter Act, but it exempts poultry. Remember what we said earlier, over 95% of the land farm animals that are raised and killed are poultry. So we have Council Directive on the protection of animals used for farming purposes. This is the general farm animal welfare law. There is no federal on-farm animal welfare law in the US. We have species-specific legislation banning the extremes of intensive farming, essentially sow stalls, barren battery cages, and veal crates. In the US, there isn't that at the federal level. They're largely permitted. 3 states ban all 3. As Peter said this morning, 11 states prohibit one of them. Of course, chlorine-washed chicken, hormone beef, ractopamine, bovine somatotropin, all widespread and routine in the US, all prohibited in the EU. And the chlorine-washed chicken is a very interesting one because I've had discussions with others about, is it really an animal welfare issue? It's a food safety issue, but actually it's a great symbol because you can tell from what I've said already, it actually represents the animal welfare problem, which is the really big animal welfare problem related to meat chickens. And the part of the reason they use chlorine is that these birds, they're raised in far poorer standards, higher stocking densities and so on. They have higher bacterial loads. They use a lot more antibiotics over in the US compared to the EU as well. So there's a problem with antimicrobial resistance developing. So it's a really good symbol, I think, for the difference between EU and the UK. And just on the experimental side, we have a directive on the protection of animals used for scientific purposes. In the US, their Animal Welfare Act exempts fish and it exempts rodents. Again, by far, the majority of animals used are rodents and fish. Okay, so as I researched this issue, what I actually began to feel was the biggest risk, even possibly bigger than the import of lower welfare standards, was the sort of the loss of political influence if we leave the European Union of the UK outside of the EU. The UK is a population of around 67 million people. It's got a unique history in animal welfare, some of the first laws, some of the first organisation, the Bramble Report, Ruth Harrison and so on. And what it's done is it's actually used, remember we talked about the UK being not just a normal member state, if you like, a powerful one. It's used its power to leverage, it's leveraged its power throughout the EU, and this is why in large part we have these bans on confinement systems and so on. Of course, other member states have played a role, and then the EU, as a big player, has been able to influence other countries like Chile or like South Korea, and no doubt has had some influence on some of the US states. So there is a real risk here, and it could be the biggest risk. And I think a good analogy to use is, because one of the Brexiteer arguments is that, well, the UK has higher animal welfare standards, therefore when we leave, we'll be free to actually, we won't be restricted in a way by the EU single market and so on. But actually, if you think as an example, Lionel Messi is a fantastic football player for Barcelona, and he does great things within that team. But if you move him out of that team and play him against Real Madrid on his own, he probably isn't going to win, no matter how good a player he is. So there's an important issue there. Okay, so looking at the Brexit opportunities, again, I looked at the same 5 criteria. And first of all, again, inherent opportunities with massive political change. And actually, if you read through the reports and speak to people involved, the NGOs aren't just writing about, okay, well, leaving the European Union permits us to do these things, like ban foie gras or whatever else. It's a whole-scale review of animal protection. We're using the opportunity, and this quotation shows how that can be done. And I think it's important to be clear, which animal protection issues are actually not possible in the European Union. So, for example, very high, rightly, on the media agenda has been the sentience of crustaceans, decapod crustaceans and cephalopods, but actually governments under the Animal Welfare Act could have listed them as sentient species for the last couple of decades, essentially. So the major opportunity is reform of our own agricultural policy. So we had the agricultural bill. And the idea here is that essentially the CAP has been criticised from all angles, from environmental point of view, for essentially taking money from the poor to fund some of the richest landowners in the UK, for having one policy across the whole of the EU. The RSPCA has criticised it for promoting intensive farming and so on. So the idea is to use subsidies not on a land area basis, but to promote animal welfare. And Compassion have done lots of good work, sort of, lobbying government on how it should do that. But if you actually look at the bill, it doesn't really read as a kind of a radical agenda for a paradise for farmed animals. Far from it. Animal welfare is mentioned twice. It's listed 7th out of 8th as a public good. The other one's environmental. Funds under the Act aren't even guaranteed until after 2027, I think it is. And now the agriculture bill's actually fallen because Boris Johnson's prorogued Parliament. So hopefully, even when it does come back, it will have more animal welfare being prominent. Live transport, I'm sure you will have seen this in the news. It's a huge flagship issue for NGOs like Compassion, RSPCA and so on. Governments have always said we can't ban live exports, which is true within the European Union. It's been tested in the courts. We can't ban it because of the single market principle, the free movement of goods. But when you start to look at the numbers, they've actually reduced an awful lot over the last 15 years or so. I think it used to be over 200,000 calves 15 years or so that were transported, as an example, and nowadays it's 50,000 or so. And just remember the context of the figures we were talking about earlier, 1 billion farmed animals, and so 50,000. We shouldn't be doing a Brexit policy on this sort of basis, just looking at one issue. The problem is there's lots of loopholes. The NGOs are actually lobbying for a full ban on both transport for slaughter and for further fattening. But there's potential loopholes, and there's even a WTO problem that I don't really have time to go into. But essentially, even the NGOs aren't lobbying for for the prohibition of exports across the Northern Irish border, because agriculture in Ireland is so integrated, and this is actually not compliant with WTO rules, because the UK will be treating the Republic of Ireland differently to other countries in the world, and so you've got a big loophole potentially for the further trade. The farming lobby, the NFU, are opposed. The Scottish Government is opposed. So the import and sale of fur products is probably actually a much bigger welfare issue in terms of numbers. The Humane Society International UK did some figures and came up with a figure: 2 million whole animal furs. The equivalent of 2 million whole animal furs are imported into the UK every year. So again, compare that to the sort of 50,000 calves or so. Fur farming is actually banned in the UK under the Fur Farming Prohibition Act in England and Wales. And there's parallel legislation, 2002 in Ireland and Scotland, Northern Ireland, Scotland. One thing I came across in my research, very interesting, if you actually, there's the single goods principle, but under Article 36, there's an exemption, again for public morality, similar to the WTO rules. And it seems to me that we could have actually banned fur farming as a member of the European Union, because we have specific legislation to prohibit the practice in the UK. There's consistent polling against all species, all wild species used, essentially. These animals are essentially still wild. But the problem is here that the government have actually signalled that they're not looking at a ban. They're looking at reform and using their influence on an international level. I think it's always good to compare. If nothing else, it keeps the pressure on the government. The Labour Party has come out with its manifesto, very, very progressive agenda. Some of you may be aware of it. And one of their pledges is to ban the import and sale. Okay, so coming to a sort of a judgment, if you like, and there are many elements of this I've kind of skipped for the purposes of time. I actually just, I think it was last night, I wrote this out, it was last night, and these figures are really not intended to be precise, but it was to give you, the audience, an idea based on my thoughts on the magnitude of these issues and the probability of them occurring. And you can probably get an idea of that from the figures that I've been using. And I would say these figures, I was looking at them earlier, probably underestimated. But in terms of magnitude, if we use sort of 10 as a yardstick, we're very high over this side. The UK loss of political influence is very intangible. It's really difficult to judge. But I mean, to put a basic argument forward, if the UK imports lower welfare products from the US, there's no way really that Brexit could ever be good, all things considered, for animal protection, just because of the sheer number of animals involved, the drag it would place on our own farming system. Our own farmers would then be lobbying government potentially for deregulation and so on. If we look at the opportunities over here, reform of UK agricultural policy, it has got great potential, but I'm just personally very sceptical, which I think is reinforced by looking at the Health and Harmony consultation prior to the agricultural bill, which has now fallen. There's a lot of vested interest involved here, and farmers will be saying, in this period of uncertainty, do we really want these sort of radical changes? No doubt there will be some schemes that are funded, but for me it's not really a radical agenda for change. This is also linked in, by the way, with things like mandatory labelling, method of production labelling, procurement policies to feed our armies and schools and hospital patients with higher welfare foods. So there is potential there. I've talked about these animals are individual sentient animals, of course, but we're looking at things on a big scale and trying to make an overall judgment. Relatively low number of animals. The probability here is for a full ban, I suppose. I've spoken to people who lobby on this, essentially, who have pretty much said we won't get a full ban. Fur products, foie gras, I didn't have time to talk about, but again, it's a smallish welfare issue. Gove, in an article a year or so ago, signalled that he wouldn't want to upset the European Union, in particular France, by banning it, or they would challenge us at the WTO. And puppy smuggling, its name very much suggests it's actually against the law. It's an enforcement problem. Lucy's Law will probably do much to mitigate it. And the problem is, one could argue, very much related to DEFRA cutting, massive DEFRA cuts over the last decade of 60-70%, and DEFRA giving a lot of its responsibility to actually monitor this to the carriers as opposed to agencies. Okay, so I've asked for permission from the organisers just to, I suppose I'm not selling it, but there's a journal called Animals, which many of you will be aware of, I'm sure I got something out of this, but I can't remember quite what. I'm now the editor, the section editor for this new section, Animals in Public Policy, Politics and Society, which of course includes law. And we welcome articles. It's peer-reviewed. I think it's a rapidly growing journal. Clive Phillips is the editor, who's based in Queensland. He used to be based in Cambridge. He worked closely with Don Broom. And it's all open access. There is a publication charge, which is around 2,000 Swiss francs, but which works out as about £700. That's the downside. But that's actually a lot cheaper than most open access. And it means that you retain copyright and so on. The great thing about it is the turnaround time is rapid. If anyone's published there, they'll be able to confirm that. Rather than waiting for your article to be published for 1 or 2 years or 6 months or whatever, you're talking about sort of 4 weeks or so potentially. Okay. So if anyone's got any questions about that, please do ask. And there's just some references from the presentation. So thanks very much for listening.